Now this is probably the most important music production video I've made so far. No one really talks about this, but if that initial idea or loop isn't amazing, then the track is not going to be amazing. It will just be possibly good or decent. I make so many sketch ideas and never finish them because the initial vibe was just average. But I always know when I have something special because the mix will be trash, the sound choices will be trash, but the vibe is just ridiculous. So today we're going to dive into what makes a loop slap, so your whole track can slap. Let's get it cracking. Tip number 1 is have designated roles for each sound. Now this is not something I do consciously. Like when I start a new track, I don't start designating the roles like I want a lead synth here, an African drum here. But every new track I add, I always go towards something that is drastically different from the sound that I just used. So for this example, I started with the vocal sample, chopped it up, and went straight to the drum kit. I didn't want to add anything in a similar frequency range to what that sample was doing or another melody. We've got the melody already, now it's time to get this punchy rhythm going. After that, I'm looking for frequency ranges and timbres of sound that I haven't used yet. So the 808 bass is sitting right underneath in the bottom. And there's a dance pluck that's sitting right on top. But also notice now that the 808 is just supporting the drum groove and the dance pluck is literally playing one note. I found spaces and roles for these sounds that don't get in the way of the first two. I think there's only 2 more sounds in this example, and that's this robot voice that I made, which is another vocal, but it sounds completely different from the Portuguese sounding one. And then I made this kind of rising future bass sound that hits just before the beat switches. These 2 sounds have specific roles, and none of them are competing with any other sound within the same loop. Tip 2 for making that loop slap is you have to make every idea as best as it can be. Whenever I make new music, I try to stay within the 4 or 8 bar loop. This is where I can really refine the core of the idea, making sure that before we add anything else or arrange the track, what we already have is amazing. Now this particular vocal sample that you hear, I went through at least 4 different variations of chopped rhythms until I got the one that I wanted. Originally, I actually made this track in Logic Pro, and in Logic you've got these things called MIDI tape folders. Now that is my secret weapon to refining every part until it bangs. Ableton has tape folders as well. It's not as good, but it gets the job done. Whenever I'm making parts of melodies, chords, drum rhythms, I try to say as much as I can with as little as possible. Just like Beethoven with those first 4 notes. Even now that I'm rebuilding this track inside Ableton, I'm trying to find even more impact inside the parts I already have. The vocal chops I have, I'm chopping them even more. For me, it's all about refining, refining, and refining again. Tip number 3. This is the most important out of all of them. Open your ears. You have to master how the parts interact with each other. I think this is like the art of orchestration, like even all the way back to the days of Mozart. How are the parts talking to each other? For me personally, out of all the things you could focus on to try and make your music better, this was the one that blew it out of the stratosphere. And I do not hear a lot of people talking about this. Once I started thinking about it consciously, I started to hear it in all my favorite songs by all my favorite producers. It's kind of like if you were drawing or painting on a blank canvas. You actually have a limited amount of space. So you need to make sure everything fits in nicely. Now there's many ways you can think about how musical parts interact with each other. But for me, I think the most important aspect of music is rhythm. So try to think about what beats are all these rhythms and notes falling on, and can you use certain rhythms to support other rhythms so when it hits, it's more impactful. Just like this robot voice that comes in just before the snare. I mean, that is cold. And you know when things are in the right place rhythmically because it hits you and it feels crazy. I think a lot of new producers make music by focusing on one sound and then going to the next sound and then going to the next sound. But over the years, I've developed this habit of jumping back and forth between every single sound, and it's really messy. And although it's messy, what I'm actually doing is I'm shaping and sculpting every sound at the same time, jumping back and forth and making sure everything fits together. This means a lot of deleting notes, changing note lengths, and chopping up samples in different rhythms. One last thing to listen out for is the spaces that I've made the 808 play a long note. The best way to describe it is this kind of comes in when the drums are at their weakest point. So when the drums are not at their strongest, the 808 comes in to fill the gap that is missing. Another thing to think about to make that loop slap is how does it evolve over time? It takes a while, but after some time, you develop that ability to hear where something has enough going on and you can kind of leave it as is and move to the next part. If you listen to this example, this loop is so basic, but it's so effective. But that gave me room to add this second section where the beat just turns up. In this second section, I'm just recycling a lot of ideas like reharmonizing the melody. The bass line is technically exactly the same, but it's just upper octave. And there's an extra hi-hat in the drum pattern just to drive that energy a bit more. Because the amount of sounds in the first half was quite minimal, I think there's only 3, right? Bass, vocal sample, and drums. And then these little effects that come in and out. They don't really count because they're so tiny and they only happen every 4 bars or something like that. But this gave me room to add an extra sound, and that's where the dance pluck came in. Now that dance pluck sound actually brings me on to my next tip, which is what are you actually trying to say within this loop? Are you actually being creative enough? Are you trying to say something different with your music? Does it play with culture and people's emotions? Is it dramatic? Does it sound like something that's unique and you've never heard before? Does it sound like something that's very familiar? So with this example, I'm trying to play with culture by blending the EDM sounds of like America and Europe that you find in dance music. This weird foreign language vocal sample, someone tell me what it is because I've got a feeling it's Portuguese. And the dirtiest drum pattern from Gram Music in London. This is not something I decided before the track. My mind just works in this way of taking things from different places. But the reason I'm saying this is an actual thing you should think about is because that's what's going to take your loop to the next level. If you've got a little basic idea of it, that's when you ask these questions of what is it actually doing. If you don't ask yourself that question, it's going to remain in this most basic stage. And that's what a lot of new producers have, are these basic loops that they didn't really question. They just done it, finished it, and sent it for people to listen to. Even as I'm rebuilding this track in Ableton Live, it still has this same vibe that gets you excited. It just sounds worse. But the thing about this loop that's going to make people scream with excitement hasn't changed. And the reason is because of how the loop was made. I was keeping all these 5 tips in mind, whether subconsciously or consciously, while I was making the loop. But that's it for me in today's video, guys. I hope you've been inspired. If you're looking for some sounds that slap, check out the link in my description. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.